You want to put that on her? Good luck, Dr. Mara said with a laugh, gesturing toward Shadow, her sleek black cat lounging lazily on the windowsill. Shadow's green eyes flicked toward the two figures standing in the room, Mara and her old friend Dr. Zorak, a Xenian scientist with an insatiable curiosity. Zorak's iridescent skin shimmered as he clutched the small silver device in his hand, a collar embedded with the latest Xenian technology. It wasn't an ordinary collar. With this device, one could hear the thoughts of animals, translating them into spoken words. The Xenians had tested it on dogs, and the results had been both fascinating and hilarious. Most of the time, dogs simply asked for food or belly rubs, but cats, well, they remained an enigma. And that's exactly what Zorak wanted to unravel. It works on every other pet we've tried, Zorak replied confidently, his wide eyes fixated on Shadow. Why not cats? I'm dying to know what they think. Mara shook her head, still amused. Because Shadow is no dog. She's never let anyone get close enough to put anything on her unless it was her idea. And believe me, this won't be her idea. Zorak's fascination only grew as he stared at the cat. To him, this was a challenge, perhaps his greatest yet. Well, she's going to be the first cat to speak, he said with determination. Just try, Mara said, taking a step back. I'll enjoy watching this. Zorak crouched low, holding the collar carefully in front of him as he inched closer to Shadow. The cat's eyes narrowed, tracking his every movement with a mix of suspicion and disinterest. Her tail flicked lazily behind her, a warning. Shadow, this will let you talk, wouldn't that be fun? Zorak said in a coaxing tone. But Shadow was no ordinary house pet, and before Zorak could even reach her, she bolted. In a blur of black fur, she leapt off the windowsill and dashed out of the room. I told you, Mara called after Zorak, who scrambled to his feet in surprise. You're not going to win this easily. She's too smart for you. Zorak was not deterred. If anything, his fascination had grown. I'm not giving up, he said, marching toward the door where Shadow had disappeared. We need to understand what goes on in the mind of a cat, and I'm going to find out one way or another. Shadow had no intention of being caught, and for the next hour, the sleek feline made a game out of evading Zorak. She dashed from room to room, slipping under tables and leaping onto high shelves with the agility only a cat could muster. Zorak, a highly advanced Xenian scientist, had mastered technologies far beyond human comprehension, but it seemed no amount of intelligence could outmatch a determined cat. Mara stood back, watching the scene unfold like a comedy. You're going to need more than just persistence to catch her, she said, a grin on her face. I've lived with Shadow for years. She's always one step ahead. But Zorak was determined. We have technology for this, he muttered. This shouldn't be impossible. Hours passed, and despite his best efforts, Zorak had made no progress. Shadow had proven far more elusive than any creature he had ever encountered, so with a sigh of resignation, he contacted his team of Xenian and human scientists, bringing in reinforcements. Within the hour, a group of 6 scientists, 3 human, 3 Xenian, arrived at Mara's house, each armed with various gadgets designed to catch even the trickiest of creatures. Zorak quickly laid out the plan. They would work together to corner Shadow and place the collar on her, allowing them to finally unlock the mysteries of the feline mind. This is overkill for a cat, Dr. Evan, a human scientist, laughed as they reviewed the strategy. But I have to admit I'm curious too. Let's see if we can actually get her. Remember, no scaring her, Zorak warned. We're trying to learn from her, not traumatize her. The team spread out through the house, closing doors, blocking exits, and laying out what they thought were perfect traps. But Shadow, it seemed, was always 2 steps ahead. Whenever they thought they had her cornered, she found another way out, slipping through a narrow window, darting under a bed, or climbing up impossibly high ledges. Every time they thought they had her, she was gone. The team had underestimated Shadow's cunning. As the hours dragged on, frustration set in. Zorak, though determined, was beginning to understand why Mara had warned him about the challenge. At one point, they had her seemingly trapped in the kitchen. Zorak slowly approached her, the collar in hand. Shadow, perched on the counter, watched him with calm, calculating eyes. Just as he reached out to put the collar on her, she sprang straight up, using a series of shelves to propel herself out of the room and into the backyard. The team rushed outside, only to find that Shadow had disappeared into the garden. Zorak groaned in frustration. "She's playing with us," he muttered. "This isn't supposed to be this hard." Mara, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, shook her head. "You're dealing with a cat, Zorak. She doesn't do anything unless it's on her terms." Finally, Dr. Evans suggested using a different approach. "We've been chasing her all day," he said. "Maybe it's time to let her come to us. She's smart, but every cat has a weakness. Let's use food." It was a simple idea, but one that had been overlooked in their excitement. They set out a plate of tuna, Shadow's favorite meal, on the kitchen floor. Then they backed off, giving her space. For hours they waited in silence, watching from a distance. Eventually, as the house grew quiet, Shadow reappeared, her movements slow and cautious. Her green eyes flicked toward the food, and after a long hesitations, she approached it. Zorak watched with bated breath as the cat began to eat. He moved slowly this time, creeping closer with the collar in hand. When he was just inches away, he reached out and success! The collar slipped around her neck. For a moment, the room was silent. Shadow froze, her eyes widening as she realized what had just happened. Then the collar activated. A soft, mechanical voice began to translate Shadow's thoughts into words. Why did you do this?" the voice said, and everyone in the room burst into laughter. Shadow's voice, though monotone, carried the unmistakable irritation of a cat being forced into something it didn't want. Zorak stepped back, wide-eyed. "It's working, we can hear her." "I didn't want this," Shadow's thoughts continued. "I liked my peace and quiet. Now you've ruined it." More laughter filled the room. Zorak, though delighted by the success of the technology, couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. "We didn't mean to invade your privacy, Shadow," he said. "We just wanted to understand what you were thinking." The collar's voice responded, "I know what it does. That's why I've been avoiding you. Cats don't want to be understood. We enjoy our mystery." Mara wiped tears of laughter from her eyes. "That sounds exactly like Shadow," she said. "She's always been too clever for her own good." Despite her initial irritation, Shadow eventually settled into the collar, though she rarely used it to speak. The team of scientists had expected deep insights into the mind of a cat, but what they got instead was a series of snarky remarks and complaints about being disturbed during naps. "I could have told you that's what she'd say," Mara said one evening, as Shadow curled up in her lap, the collar still glowing softly around her neck. "Cats have secrets. They like their independence." Zorak nodded, still fascinated. "She knows more than we expected. The fact that she was avoiding the collar because she didn't want us to hear her thoughts, it's incredible. She understood the technology." "Yeah, well, now you understand that she's not going to give you what you want," Mara said with a grin. "Cats don't care about your expectations." In the end, the scientists learned something far more valuable than they had anticipated. It wasn't about the technology or the ability to hear a cat's thoughts. It was about understanding that cats, like all creatures, had their own minds, their own boundaries, and their own way of doing things. And sometimes, they preferred to keep those thoughts to themselves. Shadow continued to live her life as she always had, aloof, independent, and completely uninterested in human expectations. The collar remained around her neck, but she only spoke when it suited her, which wasn't often. As Zorak reflected on the experience, he smiled. "Well, we've learned one thing for sure," he said. "Cats don't want to be understood, and that's what makes them so fascinating.